The Indiana dawn came heavy with fog, rolling off the cornfields like smoke from an unseen fire. Guards in greatcoats stood at the fence line, their breath rising in pale clouds, rifles slung casually over shoulders. Beyond the barbed wire, a line of Italian prisoners shuffled toward the waiting trucks, their boots crunching frost on the dirt path. The war was over now, victory secured, but the machinery of repatriation churned on like an order no one dared question. Private First Class Henry Lawson tightened his grip on his carbine and watched as one prisoner broke from the line. Corporal Antonio Rossi pressed both hands to a fence post, his knuckles white against the wood. His voice cracked in broken English. "No, I stay here. America is paradise." The words startled Lawson more than if Rossi had drawn a knife. Soldiers expected defiance from Germans, bitterness from die-hard fascists, but gratitude, even longing, from a captured Italian. That unsettled the order of things. Men behind Rossi began murmuring, some nodding in agreement, others casting eyes toward the misty horizon as if freedom meant nothing waiting across the Atlantic. The facts were simple enough. By 1945, over 51,000 Italians were confined in camps across the United States, part of the larger mass of 425,000 Axis prisoners sent inland from ports like Boston and Norfolk. Camp Atterbury was a typical sight. Heated barracks, clean uniforms stenciled PW across the back, 3 meals a day totaling more than 3,400 calories. To American soldiers, it was basic rations. To Italians who had known Mussolini's shortages and German contempt, it was abundance beyond measure. Lawson had seen the prisoners at work in the fields, driving farm trucks and tractors they could never have touched back home. He'd even heard them singing folk songs in the evenings, voices rich and unbroken by war. Watching Rossi cling to that fence post, Lawson realized something uncomfortable. The line between captor and captive was less sharp than he'd been told. The Italians were not fighting to escape. They were fighting not to leave. The convoy commander barked the order, and men pulled Rossi gently, almost apologetically, from the fence. Lawson noted their reluctance. The trucks rumbled, diesel coughing in the cold, and the fog swallowed the line of prisoners one by one. Lawson kept staring at the empty fence post. In America, he thought, even captivity feels freer than what they're going back to. 2 years earlier, Rossi had stood on a very different deck. The Atlantic stretched endless and gray, waves slapping the side of the transport ship like drums of war. He and hundreds of fellow prisoners huddled under blankets that smelled of mothballs, seasick from the voyage. They had been captured in North Africa, stripped of weapons, their futures uncertain. Rumor spread across the deck. The Americans were shipping them to camps deep in their homeland. Most expected chains, starvation, maybe even firing squads. The fear was real. This was enemy territory. But the United States operated differently. The Geneva Convention of 1929 dictated their treatment, and the Americans, with typical efficiency, adhered not just to the letter, but to the spirit. At disembarkation points like Boston and Norfolk, Italian prisoners were processed with clinical precision. They were issued uniforms, medical checkups, and hot meals. Instead of iron bars, there were wooden barracks with heating. Instead of starvation, steaming coffee pots lined the mess hall. The numbers staggered the imagination. By 1943, the U.S. had ferried more prisoners than Britain could possibly manage. 51,000 Italians, 371,000 Germans, and even a few thousand Japanese, all packed into a network of 21 major camps across 18 states. Rossi's ship was one of dozens. On his convoy sailed the USS General W.P. Richardson, capable of carrying thousands at a time, each ship a floating factory of discipline and logistics. Captain Charles H. Moore, newly appointed commandant of Camp Atterbury, studied the arrival rosters with a sense of surreal scale. Every prisoner meant another mouth to feed, another uniform to issue, another bunk to assign. Yet in a country that had produced 50,000 Sherman tanks and 300,000 aircraft in a few short years, feeding prisoners seemed no great burden. What other nation could capture its enemies by the tens of thousands and still have the resources to treat them humanely? As Rossi stepped down the gangplank, he braced for cruelty. Instead, he was handed a tin cup of hot coffee. He sniffed it, half expecting a trick, then tasted. The bitterness shocked him. It was real coffee, not chicory or roasted barley like at home. In that moment, suspicion cracked. They stepped onto American soil, bracing for chains, Moore reflected in his diary, and found coffee instead. The first time Mary Whitaker saw the Italians, they were bent over rows of soybeans, their foreign songs rising above the rustling stalks. She was 17, daughter of a farmer whose draft-age sons were all overseas. Her father's fields would have gone unharvested if not for the unexpected labor force housed at Camp Atterbury. At first, the barbed wire made her nervous. Prisoners, after all, were supposed to be dangerous. But these men smiled, waved, even tipped imaginary hats when she passed. It was wartime necessity that blurred the lines. With American manpower siphoned to Europe and the Pacific, the War Department authorized Italian service units, detachments of POWs who labored under guard but outside the fences. They mended roads, worked warehouses, unloaded cargo at depots, and above all, harvested crops. Atterbury's men alone would contribute thousands of man-hours, part of the million logged nationwide. Mary watched as one prisoner, his name stitched in careful thread onto his uniform, clambered into her father's tractor. It was an Alice Chalmers Model WC, orange paint dulled by dust, but still roaring to life with a pull of the choke. The Italian stroked the wheel as if it were gold. For him, machinery like this was beyond imagination. In rural Sicily, farming still meant wooden plows and oxen. Here, prisoners drove tractors worth more than their families' homes. Lawson, assigned to guard the farm detail, stood nearby smoking a Lucky Strike. He chuckled at Mary's curiosity. "Don't worry, miss." They'd sooner kiss the dirt than make trouble. The scene played itself out across America. At Camp Hereford in Texas, POWs picked cotton under scorching sun. In Montana, they chopped timber with Army-issued axes. In New Jersey, they unloaded Liberty ships groaning with war cargo. Everywhere, civilians were struck by the same contradiction. The enemy worked their fields, but instead of fear, there was laughter, music, even friendship. At supper that evening, Mary sat at the farmhouse table listening to her father praise the Italians' labor. "Best hands I've had since your brothers shipped out," he said, buttering bread baked from wheat those same prisoners had helped harvest. Mary thought of their singing, the way the foreign words floated like prayers. The enemy became neighbors, and neighbors began to wonder why anyone would send them away. The mess hall smelled of bacon fat and boiling coffee, a perfume so rich it made the prisoners dizzy before they even stepped through the door. Rossi carried his tin tray forward in line, watching the cooks ladle scrambled eggs, heap fried potatoes, and stack slices of white bread. The portions were staggering. He glanced at Lawson, who stood at the door with his rifle slung casually. For the American Guard, it was routine. For Rossi, it was an unfathomable banquet. In Italy, a man counted himself lucky to taste meat once a week. Under Mussolini, sugar had become a black market treasure. Coffee, a memory replaced by scorched barley. Bread was rationed by ounces, and the bitter winter of 1943 left many families boiling weeds for soup. Here, at Camp Atterbury, even prisoners consumed 3,400 calories daily, the same as U.S. soldiers. White bread, butter, fruit, coffee, luxuries stacked high on steel trays. Rossi bit into his bread and nearly laughed. It was fresh, soft as clouds, baked that morning in ovens powered by the endless rivers of American wheat. He caught sight of another Italian staring at the refuse bins. Soldiers tossed away crusts, half-eaten apples, even entire sandwiches. Rossi whispered, "In Calabria, my family would fight for that apple core." His comrade only shook his head in disbelief. Lawson had grown numb to it. He'd seen mess halls dump enough leftovers to feed a regiment. To him it was waste. To Rossi, it was proof of an empire of plenty. American farmers produced such surpluses that bread could be discarded without thought. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps moved 17 million tons of food during the war, a logistical feat no Axis power could match. The contrast grew sharper with every meal. Italians wrote home of steaming coffee and Sunday roasts, letters that stunned families scraping by on meager rations. Rumors circulated in Italy that prisoners in America lived like kings. For many, those rumors were true. That evening, Rossi leaned back on his bunk, belly full, ears ringing with the sound of laughter drifting from the barracks. He stared at the ceiling and thought of the farm kitchen back home, where hunger had always been another family member at the table. Here, even waste tasted of mercy. For the first time since capture, Rossi prayed not for release, but for the chance to remain. The first time Rossi placed his hands on the steering wheel of the Alice Chalmers tractor, he felt as though he had climbed into a machine from another world. The Model WC roared to life with a pull of the starter, its four-cylinder engine growling steady as it rolled across the soil. In Sicily, farming meant oxen and wooden plows. Here, steel teeth bit the earth with ease, churning more furrows in an hour than his village could manage in a week. Lawson leaned against the fence, lighting a cigarette, while Mary Whitaker watched from the edge of the field. She had grown up with tractors. To her, the rumbling machine was ordinary. But the expression on Rossi's face, half reverence, half disbelief, told her she was watching a man witness sorcery. The revelation was everywhere in America. Convoys of GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks rolled past the camp, canvas tops rippling in the wind, each hauling more supplies in a single trip than an Italian regiment could field in a month. Boxcars stacked with grain thundered along the rails, bound for depots where Italian service units unloaded crates of canned goods, ammunition, and uniforms. The scale overwhelmed every comparison. In 1944 alone, American factories produced 96,000 trucks, more than Italy had manufactured in the entire decade before the war. Where German divisions marched on foot, Americans motorized entire armies. Where Italian farmers still harvested with scythes, American prisoners drove tractors worth more than their family farms. Mary recalled the day a local boy asked one of the Italians why he stared at the machines so long. The prisoner replied softly, "Because this is the sound of victory." That evening, Rossi lay awake in his barracks, listening to the distant drone of engines along the highway. He thought of Mussolini's speeches about destiny, about reviving Rome. Yet destiny seemed smaller when measured against American assembly lines. Here was a nation that could flood the world with tanks and tractors alike, whose factories made no distinction between feeding soldiers and feeding prisoners. As the engines faded into the night, Rossi whispered to himself, "A country that builds like this cannot lose." The letter arrived folded in thin blue paper, its edges frayed from travel across a broken Europe. Rossi opened it slowly, the Italian words trembling before his eyes. His mother wrote of hunger, of bombed-out buildings in Messina, of neighbors scavenging weeds to boil for soup. She told him his younger brother wore shoes stitched from rags. "Return home quickly," she wrote. "We need you." Rossi stared at the barracks around him, wooden bunks lined neatly, stoves glowing with coal, uniforms washed and folded. He smelled coffee drifting from the mess, heard laughter rising from the soccer field outside. His mother's Italy seemed a ghost compared to the world he now lived in. Freedom was waiting for him in ruins. Captivity offered warmth, food, and dignity. He was not alone. Word spread through the camp as more letters arrived. Families wrote of rationing, of black markets, of political chaos as Italy staggered under occupation and civil war. Some prisoners wept openly, others clenched fists in silence. Slowly, a phrase began to circulate in halting English. "We do not want to go back." Captain Charles Moore heard it too. At his desk, stacks of orders reminded him that Washington demanded repatriation. Italy needed its men to rebuild. Yet every week, another group of prisoners came forward with petitions begging to remain. Moore sympathized, but his orders were clear. America had fought a war to free Europe. Now those same Europeans resisted freedom's call. The irony was sharp. In Germany, POWs plotted escape at every turn. In the Soviet Union, millions perished in brutal camps. But in America, Italians clung to captivity, terrified not of their guards, but of release. On a gray November morning, Rossi confided in Lawson. "I go home. I starve. Here, I live like soldier, like man Lawson, at a loss, only nodded." He could not deny the truth. That night, Rossi tucked his mother's letter into his pillow, torn between duty to family and the bitter knowledge that his safest choice was to remain behind barbed wire. Freedom, he realized, was not the absence of fences, it was the presence of bread. The sun rose red over the Indiana fields, spilling light across rows of wheat ready for the scythe. The POW work detail marched out under guard, boots crunching dew-soaked earth, their chatter low but cheerful. Rossi bent to the stalks, swinging the scythe with practiced rhythm. The metal sliced clean, stalks falling in neat lines. He paused only to wipe sweat from his brow, the early summer already heavy with heat. Lawson leaned on a fence post, rifle slung loose, watching the scene. He knew the harvest was vital. Across America, farms strained under shortages of labor, men drafted overseas, families stretched thin. Without the POWs, the fields might have gone uncut. Instead, Italian service units filled the gap, supplying over 1 million man-hours of labor nationwide. It was not charity. The wheat they cut here in Indiana would move by rail to depots, then onward across oceans. American surpluses fed soldiers, allies, and even liberated civilians in Europe. The irony was sharp. Italian prisoners working under guard in Indiana harvested grain that might one day feed their own hungry families back home. Mary watched from her father's porch, a basket of eggs under her arm. She could hear the steady hiss of scythes and the occasional burst of song in Italian, a melody foreign yet strangely comforting. She thought of her brothers fighting in Europe, one in France, the other in the Pacific. And here, on the same soil they left behind, their former enemies now worked to keep the home front alive. The numbers staggered belief. In a single summer, POWs harvested enough wheat, corn, and soybeans to supply relief shipments equal to the entire annual output of some European nations still crippled by war. The United States, already the arsenal of democracy, had become its breadbasket too. Factories forged tanks and planes, but farms turned out grain in such volumes that waste became routine. Rossi swung his scythe again, pausing to stretch aching shoulders. He glanced at Lawson, who smoked a cigarette in the shade, and offered a wry smile. "In Italy, we cut with sickle, little by little. Here, even prisoners harvest for the world." Lawson nodded, flicking ash into the dirt. For the first time, he understood. The barbed wire was less a cage than a bridge between continents, funneling American plenty towards starving Europe. The prisoners of Indiana fed not just America, but nations still clawing their way out of ruin. Snow drifted across the Indiana compound, settling in white heaps against the barracks. Rossi pulled his blanket tighter, listening to the creak of the stove as it radiated warmth. He thought of comrades sent east to fight alongside Germans, men captured by the Soviets. Their letters, when they came, spoke of starvation, of endless marches through snow, of comrades collapsing in ditches and never rising again. Some letters never came at all. The contrast was unbearable. In Soviet camps, mortality rates for Axis prisoners climbed as high as 35%. In American camps, it stayed below 1%. Where Russians marched prisoners to death, Americans issued warm coats and meat rations. The difference was not merely mercy, it was the sheer capacity to supply abundance. Lawson had read intelligence reports comparing POW conditions across continents. The Germans starved their captives deliberately. The Soviets lacked the resources even to feed their own. Yet America, flush with surpluses, treated enemy soldiers with a decency that shocked even the prisoners themselves. To Rossi, it felt like stepping from one civilization into another. The Germans had called Italians cowards, mocking their collapse after 1943. Yet here, behind American fences, Rossi felt more like a man than he ever had under Mussolini's black shirts. He recalled a German officer sneering, "Better to die than surrender." But death fed no family, and surrender to America meant bread, work, and dignity. Mary heard the comparisons too. One prisoner confided during a break in the fields, "In Russia, we would already be dead." She shivered at the thought. It was one thing to know the Allies had won the war. It was another to see that victory measured in human survival. Statistics whispered truths the battlefield could not. The United States could build 50,000 tanks in a single year, more than Italy had produced in 2 decades. But its true strength lay in the simple fact that even its enemies lived better in captivity than as free men under totalitarian rule. One night Rossi looked out through the frost-coated window at the snow falling soft on Indiana soil. He imagined the forests of the East, where millions shivered in the dark. By comparison, the crackle of the stove felt like America's quietest victory. By comparison, America's mercy was its mightiest weapon. It began as a hum in the corner of the barracks, low and tentative. One voice swelled into another, and soon the room filled with the deep resonance of Italian folk songs. Rossi sang too, his voice steady, rising into harmonies that carried through the thin wooden walls. Outside, the night air was crisp, and the sound drifted toward the fence where Lawson paused on patrol. He tilted his head, startled at the richness of the music. The townsfolk heard it too. By midsummer, word spread that the Italians sang like trained choirs. Families gathered outside the fences on Sundays, standing in clusters to listen. Some brought folding chairs, others simply stood under the stars, hands tucked in coat pockets, letting the music wash over them. There were arias, folk ballads, even hymns sung in Latin. To Mary, it felt less like captivity and more like a concert hall transplanted into a cornfield. The camp command allowed organized performances, supervised but encouraged. Local churches invited Italian singers to perform at Christmas services, their voices filling sanctuaries with warmth that momentarily erased the bitterness of war. One chaplain wrote, "They remind us that even the enemy has a soul." Cultural exchanges grew in unexpected places. Soccer games drew crowds, American guards curious to watch the sport played with such passion. Prisoners laughed when GIs tried to join, their clumsy kicks sending the ball skidding into the weeds. In turn, Lawson taught a few Italians the rules of baseball, explaining strikes and innings in a mix of English and gestures. Music, games, food, these became the threads stitching humanity across the barbed wire. What began as guarded labor details transformed into community rituals. Children waved at prisoners from roadsides. Farmers traded stories with men who had once worn Mussolini's insignia. The war seemed far away. Yet beneath the laughter lay the same unspoken question: what would happen when the fences opened? Rossi sang louder, as if willing the notes to linger in American air, to anchor him to the soil he did not want to leave. The songs became his plea, his way of saying without words that captivity had become home. Lawson listened from his post, the voices echoing into the night. He thought of his brothers overseas, of the battles still raging in memory. And yet here, on this quiet patch of Indiana, the war seemed to be ending not with gunfire, but with music. The fences were still there, but the war that built them was fading into memory. The trains stood waiting, black smoke curling against the spring sky of 1946. Orders had come down from Washington. The Italians would be sent home. The war was over, the camps no longer necessary, and Italy needed its sons for rebuilding. Yet at Camp Atterbury, the scene unfolding was not one of relief, but of grief. Prisoners clutched fence posts, their hands white-knuckled, some weeping openly as guards urged them toward the waiting boxcars. Rossi was among them. His boots scraped against the gravel as he walked slowly, each step heavier than the last. Around him, men muttered in Italian, their voices thick with despair. "Why leave?" one asked aloud. "Here, we live as men. At home, we starve." The words hung in the air, echoing across the compound. Captain Charles Moore stood at the platform, his jaw set. He had received petition after petition, prisoners pleading to stay, citing work, friendships, even marriages of the heart. Some farmers wrote letters too, begging to keep the men who had become indispensable. Moore sympathized, but his orders were clear. The State Department had little patience for sentimental exceptions. Italy was no longer enemy, and America could not be seen as stealing its manpower. The irony cut deep. A nation that had fought to free Europe now forced men back into a freedom that offered only hunger and ruin. Guards moved gently, almost apologetically, guiding men onto the trains. Lawson, standing watch, saw tears streaking faces hardened by years of war. He had never imagined prisoners clinging to captivity like this. One man knelt suddenly, pressing his lips to Indiana soil, scooping a handful into his pocket as a keepsake. Another broke into song, his voice quavering but strong, others joining until the platform rang with harmony. The sound carried across the fields, a last farewell to a land they had come to love. Moore turned away, unable to watch. The train whistle blew, a mournful cry that drowned the singing. The cars lurched forward, carrying men away not from captivity, but from what they now considered paradise. America had won them not through conquest, but through comfort. In the War Department's offices, clerks tallied numbers with the same precision as artillerymen setting their sights. Ledgers recorded not only tanks and aircraft, but the hidden economy of captivity. Italian POWs had logged over 1 million man-hours of labor, harvesting crops, unloading depots, and mending roads. Their work filled gaps left by drafted farmers and absent dock hands, ensuring that America's war machine never slowed. The numbers spoke louder than speeches. 50,000 Sherman tanks rolled off assembly lines. 300,000 aircraft filled Allied skies. 96,000 trucks poured from factories in a single year. These figures dwarfed entire Axis national outputs. American factories built more warplanes in a month than Italy had produced in the entire war. Such abundance made even mercy possible. Lawson, months after the last prisoners left, recalled the waste bins behind the mess hall. He had watched bread crusts and apples tossed aside daily, enough to feed villages. It seemed wasteful then, but now he understood. Waste itself was a weapon. America produced so much that it could discard more in a week than Mussolini's armies consumed in a year. That imbalance was the war's quietest revelation. For Rossi and his comrades, this statistical avalanche had been experienced as full stomachs, sturdy boots, and heated barracks. For policymakers in Washington, it was proof that the arsenal of democracy was also the granary of the world. Italy might have been defeated in battle, but it was America's factories and farms that secured the peace. One official memo summed it bluntly. The treatment of enemy prisoners has been not only a moral obligation, but a demonstration of the superiority of American resources. Numbers transformed into policy, policy into history. The United States did not just defeat fascism, it overwhelmed it, crushed it beneath mountains of steel and oceans of grain. Lawson closed his eyes and thought of Rossi's words. Here, even prisoners live like men. The war had been decided not just in blood, but in bushels and barrels. Spring settled gently over Indiana, fields greening once more, the barracks at Atterbury standing silent. The fences still stretched across the compound, but they enclosed emptiness now. Rossi was gone, carried eastward by the trains, clutching the single apple Lawson had pressed into his hand as a farewell. On the journey, he turned it over again and again, inhaling its sweet scent as though trying to trap America in his palm. In Italy, he returned to rubble and ration cards, to queues for bread that barely filled a belly. Yet he carried stories of America, of tractors that roared louder than sermons, of bread baked fresh each morning, of waste bins filled with food his family would have treasured. Neighbors listened in disbelief. Some mocked him, others fell silent. But the seed was planted. Within a decade, many former POWs would return across the Atlantic, this time not in chains but with visas, seeking the land where captivity had felt freer than liberty. They settled on farms, in factories, in neighborhoods that welcomed their labor. Their children grew up American, their accents softened, but their memories carried the same refrain. In America, even prisoners were free. Captain Moore retired with quiet pride, still haunted by the faces of men begging to stay. Lawson returned to his farm, never forgetting the songs sung in barracks under the stars. And Mary, grown now, remembered the day when enemies became neighbors, when music and harvest blurred the line between sides. The legacy reached beyond personal memory. Italy aligned with the West, its government stabilized, its people pulled into the orbit of a nation that had shown its strength not only in battle, but in mercy. Soft power, born from surplus, reshaped the post-war world. The final irony lingered. Mussolini's grand dreams of empire collapsed into dust, while America, without seeking it, conquered through generosity. Rossi had said it best, his words echoing in Lawson's mind long after the trains departed. In America, he had whispered, apple in hand, even prisoners had found freedom. And through them, the world discovered what democracy could build.